Welcome everybody. I'm so excited for tonight. I'm so excited about the new edition of Goodbye to All That. The original came out in 2013, and after every editor and agent I ever met in my life telling me, great idea, don't do it, I did it, and it's been a hit. And then Seal Press said, how about revamping it? And then after they said that, we had a pandemic, and all of a sudden there were new things to talk about leaving New York. So it feels like a really good time to be doing this. And I'm so excited to have 4 contributors with me, and also Isaac Fitzgerald, a dear friend, who is in the follow-up book, Never Can Say Goodbye. And so we're gonna talk about the subject. We're also going to have readings by the 4 contributors who are here tonight, and then a little Q&A. So I first want to just thank Isaac and the contributors, and I also want to thank Books Are Magic, which is owned by Emma Straub, and I think her husband Michael, and but she also has an essay in Goodbye to All That. So that's why I wanted to bring it to Books Are Magic for the launch tonight. So anyway, welcome. And Isaac, take it away.
Well, you just got started on kind of the place I wanted to begin. Sorry, and again, congratulations on this new edition. And I basically wanted to ask what what made you want to kind of do a new edition to kind of add on to this collection that existed, and what was it like working on it in the past year during this pandemic?
So Seal Press came to me in the fall of 2019 and said, this book is still doing well. It would do better if we revamped it. And I was only too excited to have them come to me because working on the original edition was such a thrill for me. It was so much fun. And then also doing events back in 2013. I mean, it was like a whole other life ago. So I was so excited to be asked, and I reached out to a number of contributors, and we got it going in the fall of 2019. And then all of a sudden, everything changed. We had a pandemic, and now people were leaving New York. And also, some of the women who were writing were also touching on that. Emily's essay touches on the experience of being in Harlem, where a lot of people were, disappearing, and asking those who stayed behind to take in their packages. Carolita Johnson talks about how the pandemic actually brought her back to New York City because Kingston became too expensive. Everybody fleeing New York City was suddenly changing the real estate market here, and now she's back in Queens with her mom. So, the narrative changed a little bit, and I feel like, though, there's always going to be something to say about the push-pull that New York City exerts on its inhabitants. There are always so many different reasons why you want to stay and why you want to go, and why so many people are conflicted a lot of the time. It's a great place to live, and it's also a hard place to live on many levels. And so I feel like this is a conversation that can always be had.
Yeah, and it's constantly ongoing. And to that point, I'm going to open up a couple of questions here to all of the wonderful contributors who have joined us. And I'm going to start with Didion, because that seems like a good place to start. To quote, I was in love with New York. I do not mean love in any colloquial way. I mean that I was in love with the city, the way you love the first person who ever touches you, and you never love anyone quite that way again. So I wanted to ask, what is it about New York? Or to be more specific, can you share one of the ways New York has touched you? And Rosie, I know you're coming from Ireland and it's midnight there, so it seems very unfair to start with you, but that's where I'm going to start.
That's okay, Isaac. It's so good to see you and to see my fellow contributors and editor and everyone who's here. Isaac, this question is actually hard for me. I don't know among the contributors how many are my fellow native New Yorkers. But I was born and raised in New York, and I feel like the essential perspective I lack is knowing what it feels like to come to New York. I will never have that experience. So I think I might love New York in a different way, as someone who was born there, who probably took it for granted for a long time until I really learned how to use and love New York as a young adult, I'd say. But I mean, I can say, I don't regret leaving New York, at least for now. I'll always love New York. And there is so much I miss. And now that I see museums opening up and friends taking pictures at the Met, I miss the food so much, which might sound shallow, but oh my God, you have it so good when you're there. And there's just that New York feeling, on a gorgeous spring day when you're walking around, making eye contact, interacting with just the range of humanity in New York, which is another thing I really miss. There's nothing like it.
Amen. Amen. What about you, Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't raised in New York. I was born in New York, and I grew up in northern New Jersey, so in a New York suburb. So I always felt like I was an exile from my true home. I just like hated growing up in the suburbs, and I always, we grew up coming back to the city all the time, and so I always kind of understood that like it would be the place I would go like as soon as I was free from my parents' home. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it just feels like home to me. And part of that home feeling is also like complaining about it constantly. So, I've been here for like almost 30 years, and every year I'm like, I got to get out of here. But then I'm like, but where would I go? And, so here I am, still in love with the city in my own way.
In your own way. Leslie?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear Rosie and Lisa starting off with those stories of kind of somehow beginning in New York. Or Rosie, one of the things I loved about your contribution was sort of articulating or transcribing the move to Brooklyn itself from Manhattan as a migration. And I think it particularly struck me reading your piece during the pandemic, because I feel like Brooklyn and Manhattan have never felt further to me really as they did during the pandemic. Like they really did start to feel like two separate cities because we weren't going back and forth between them. I mean, I am such an outsider to New York. I grew up in LA, which is also a big city, but a very different kind of big city. And for a long time when I was young, I always wanted, like I remember going off to college and desperately wanting to be a person who could be mistaken for being a person who's from New York, which I didn't have any idea how to do. Is like, I basically like wearing scarves was like the varsity level effort I brought to that. I was like, if I just wear enough scarves, maybe people will think I'm from New York. But there was something about, I think the first time I lived in New York in my early 20s, I felt always, as so many people do, like it was this elusive, to speak to that Didion quote, like it was less that maybe I fell in love in New York, but I felt like it was this elusive lover who had never even noticed me across the room, and I was sitting there pining for New York, but New York was always happening somewhere else, or it wouldn't quite open itself to me. And I even remember the first time I lived in New York, like I would go on these dates and I felt like they would never, like it would always be like we'd like walk around for 4 hours, but we'd never kiss or something. There was something that felt so unconsummated and elusive about New York. And the essay I wrote for the anthology was about leaving New York that first time around. I now have lived in Brooklyn for I guess almost 8 years, so I'm could also maybe contribute to an anthology about not leaving New York. But to me, it felt like for me, a big part of my New York experience was having that first experience of coming and feeling so fully outside of it, even when I was in it, and then kind of coming back and trying to figure out how to do it a little bit more on my own terms, or making a home. And the pandemic in a way has felt like the first time that Brooklyn has really, really felt like home to me, because I've just been here, just like really, really here. So I don't know, it's been a journey.
So solidifying that relationship through like a very difficult year, that makes you feel very of that place.
Yeah, I think it's that. I think I also have I have a toddler, and I think you notice place in a different way when you're with a little person too, like both because her view is so she's interested in garbage in a different way than I am, so you're sort of, I feel like there's also a kind of intensified presence that comes from being in the company of a little person a lot.
Absolutely. Emily, what about you? Kind of what is it about New York, or can you speak to one time that New York really touched you as a writer, as a person?
Yeah, I can. I'm just responding also to what Leslie just shared about the re-enchantment with New York that happens as a parent raising children in New York. Well, like Lisa, I'm a Jersey girl. I grew up in Jersey, kind of in the shadow and thrall of New York City and always knew I'd wind up here, and moved here after graduating from college. So that's 23 years ago now. So my entire adult life has been here. I haven't left. And I had occasion to almost leave once. After my husband and I had children, we were offered a joint job offer at a university in New Hampshire, and we were quite tempted because we thought, oh my gosh, we could have a house with a yard. We could maybe raise chickens. We could have a pear orchard. We could have a zip line. We could have space and freedom and nature at a level that we've never had. And so we seriously entertained that option. And then during that period where we were considering it, I happened to be on the subway train with my toddler. He was a toddler at the time, my son, and the Showtime boys came through. For those of you who are non-New Yorkers, like Showtime boys, particularly the stretch of the A train track between 59th Street and 125th Street, which is the longest tract of uninterrupted subway in New York City, is like the longest time where you're not pausing at a different station. You have these like little dance troupes of breakdancing guys come in with their boombox, and they do these aerial gymnastics that defy gravity, where somehow nobody gets kicked, even though they're doing backflips and like hanging from the poles vertically. And I just thought, and my son was so amazed, like, and he asked me, are they superheroes? And I had to say, yes, they are. And you know what we couldn't see in New Hampshire? Superheroes. Like every day, there's magic every day. And that's just like one little thing that you even take for granted after you've seen the Showtime boys a number of times. You might roll your eyes when they come through. But like for a toddler, I think just the enchantment, that was the reason I was like, I don't think we can leave. There's too much magic every day, like constantly interrupting and surprising you, even with all the challenges and difficulties. That's a kind of magic you can't find elsewhere.
I absolutely love the idea of you turning down an academic job offer because you were like, it was Showtime. I'm sorry, it was Showtime. That is absolutely fantastic. I wanted to ask, and this is just because you are all such smart, interesting, cool people. This is basically almost like I find myself exploring the city a lot. Has been what's happening for me during the pandemic. I've been walking a ton. So I was just wondering, what are some of your favorite places in New York, whether it's for reading, for writing, or anything else? Like what are, and Lisa, Rosie, you look like you look like you got an answer. So I'm gonna
Isaac, another thing that's made me yearn for New York is your photos from your walks in Greenwood Cemetery, which was, my great neighborhood local, the place where I walked more than anywhere else, more than I walked in the park. And it's just so beautiful and so calming and so special. And I have loved ones buried there who I used to visit all the time. So I really miss that place.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw, I found that gravestone that has a giant bear.
Yes, of course, bear.
And then I found the like 2002 New York Times article about it and the history there, and we don't need to get into all that. But so you find yourself really missing Greenwood Cemetery.
I do, and we have beautiful cemeteries here in the village, but they're not my cemetery the way Greenwood is.
Yeah.
Just a real oasis in Brooklyn. I love that place.
I was gonna say, because Ireland, I was like, you guys got some good green cemeteries.
They're not bad. They're pretty good.
Lisa, what about you? Is there a spot or a place that you just absolutely adore?
So many. I walk. I'm a city biker too. I love Greenwood. I'm obsessed with it. I awarded myself a writing residency at Greenwood a few years ago, where I would just go write among the dead. And I've actually been there like at least once a week during the pandemic. I have a favorite grave that I've ate like on that grave. I've cried on it. Like it's just some random guy, dead guy from the 1920s or something. So I love Greenwood.
Hang on, I'm sorry. Is it the view from the grave? Is it the name on the head? So what calls you to that?
Oh, it's just it's accessible to close to where I live, and he has his own staircase, and it's one of the ones that has like, it's like the size of like a Manhattan studio, you know, but it's just like a corpse inside. So, and it's got like a set of little stairs and a little stairwell and a doorway, so you can like hang out there and have shade and a view. So it's like, it's a nice place to be. I also love Red Hook. I lived there for a few years, and I love like being close to the water. And Prospect Park too has been a lifesaver.
Yeah, absolutely. Leslie?
Well, I was going to say, just to respond, it's amazing to hear all of you guys talk about the city and just think about what Lisa was sharing. Like, I love the ways that living in New York apartments also sensitizes you to space in a different way. Like, that you might look at like a stairway in a cemetery and be like, that's a great, I could put a desk there. You know what I mean? Like, you sort of get really, I remember the first apartment I lived in the city was like a 5th floor walk up with like a little skylight above the kitchen, and when people would come from out of town, they would be like, oh, you must get beautiful light in the skylight. But when other people who lived in New York would come over, they would always be like, do you put your luggage up there? You know, like, it was always like space, like, how can I maximize it and use it? And but it also kind of opens you up to little spaces that exist everywhere in the world, and what you maybe how you could fit your body into them or find a kind of enchantment in them. I've really been loving the Gowanus Canal during the pandemic. I go there with my daughter quite a bit, and I think at first it came from, I mean, I'd always kind of loved the Gowanus Canal. I've done some like rituals, and to me it feels like a kind of a place for spells in a way that I can't totally explain. Maybe it also just feels like you can throw stuff in there even though, you know, you maybe shouldn't, just because so much has been thrown before. But I think I really wanted to go to be in a place that felt different, visually different, and bodily just different from, you know, the streets of my neighborhood. And so the Gowanus felt like this other kind of space. But now it's really become just like a part of this shared language with my daughter. Like when we play at home, we play like they're doing this big dredging and cleaning of the canal right now. So there are these huge barges that are just like, you know, they pulled up a couple of cars a few months ago. I'm sure there are more. The article in the Post was like, it could be a Mercedes, you know, which is a weird sort of a capitalist aspirational desire, even for it to have been a Mercedes. But my daughter plays now like cleaning the water. Like that's one of the games she plays at home because of the canal. So I kind of love also that this like dirty, grimy little underdog river is her vision of a river in a way. So that's been one of our pandemic sort of, I don't know, uncoverings.
I absolutely love it down there. It's fantastic. Emily?
I love my own building. I mean, I think the pandemic has made us like hyper aware of the hyper local in ways that have felt maddening at times, but also like kind of have renewed appreciation for, you know, the beauty of the immediately local. I live in a 6-story apartment building in Washington Heights. There's 44 apartments. I know everybody who lives here, especially the other people with kids. I love a little alleyway that we turned into a garden together. I love the super who lives in the basement. You know, I love hearing the other people through the walls, and I missed not hearing them when some of them left, you know. I was happy to see them when they came back, and the ones who didn't come back, I still miss. But I like living. I like communal living, and you know, I like the democracy of it, and the grand experiments of sharing space and walls, and the ways we take care of each other. Yeah, I love my building.
Yeah, and being close.
Yeah.
Sari, is there something about New York that you just absolutely love? You have a fond memory of?
I miss it so much. In fact, the last time I went down for work was to talk to Leslie's class, March 1st, 2020. I went to Leslie's apartment in Brooklyn. And I just miss New York so much. A year away, more than a year, it's torture for me. I love to walk around the city, walk around different neighborhoods. But, you know, home for me is the East Village. And I think it will always be my spiritual home. I lived there for 15 years. I miss Tompkins Square Park. It played a role in how I met my husband. And he lived in a loft on Tompkins Square Park that I moved into, that we got kicked out of so that Michelle Gondry could come and pay 4 times what we were paying. And I miss that building. It was a historic building that was the yeshiva that George Burns went to. I just love that there's all these stories beneath stories, but like there's this, like, it's like an architectural dig. There's a story under each story of every place you go to. So I miss Tompkins Square Park. I miss that apartment that we lived in, that loft. You know what? I was just realizing I miss Jamie Attenberg's old apartment where she used to have readings, and it had a view of the Manhattan Bridge, and it just had this incredible view. And if I'm not mistaken, before she moved out, there was like a huge building going up that was going to be obstructing the view. She now lives in New Orleans, but boy, did I like going there.
And it was a tremendous view, and I believe you're absolutely correct. That view is now gone, which speaks to, I mean, that is how you get stories on top of stories on top of stories, right? Because that's always changing. So I'm just going to say real quick to everybody in the audience who's been so wonderful and festive, if you have a question, you can drop it in the Q&A. We're going to take a brief moment here to have all of our contributors read. But if you have a wonderful question for our contributors, we're going to have some readings here, and then we will be able to get to your questions. So don't be shy. If you've got a question, put it in that Q&A button. We deeply appreciate it. And Rosie, do you want to start us off? You've been our go-to, our anchor.
Sure, Isaac, that's fine. I want to apologize a little bit. It's after midnight where I am. I did take a good afternoon nap, but I'm a little sleepy. I've also been having some real dental surus, as we like to say in Yiddish, this week. So my reading voice isn't as clear as I like it to be, but I'll do the best I can. And I'm just going to read a little section from my essay, which is called Homemaker. That's partly about my home of 23 years in South Slope, right near Greenwood Cemetery, which so many of us love. But also partly about the home that I modeled my home on, my aunt and uncle's apartment. So I'll just dive in. In decorating my Brooklyn apartment, my role models were my Aunt Ellen and Uncle Bill, bohemian radicals of the old school, who lived in a sprawling warren of rooms right where they belonged, 1 block west of Washington Square Park, in the heart of Greenwich Village. Antique Persian carpets covered most of their creaky wooden floorboards. In the narrow front hall, a gallery of framed portraits of their heroes lined the yolk yellow walls. Sacco and Vanzetti, Emiliano Zapata, John Brown, about whom a friend has aptly said, he was crazy, but he wasn't wrong. I called their apartment the People's Palace. Red silk that had aged and softened persimmon was pinned to the walls of the living room, but to call it a living room is careless. It was a salon where, save for just a few intrusions of modern life, I could easily imagine Emma Goldman and John Reed arguing the respective merits of anarchy versus Bolshevism while draining a bottle of absinthe under the Victorian tiger's eye glass chandelier, the huge Cuban oil painting, the massive hand-painted old placard picked up in New Orleans that advertised Princess Zina, whose method of divination was flower scopes, who might have read your fortune in bougainvillea blossoms and birds of paradise from a stall in Jackson Square. In the study a few steps up from the salon, a recamier stretched out in the center of the room, dressed lavishly in cushions and coverlets, under a ceiling from whose center cascaded a tent-like canopy of silk panels. At the back of the room, a glass curio cabinet contained a collection of skulls, wooden, beaded, clay, ivory, metal. I am fighting a war against minimalism, Bill liked to say, and winning. More marvels filled the small kitchen, the massive brass-hinged oak apothecary cabinets Ellen discovered on the side of a road, their shimmery old glass fronts still intact, hardware still in place, the delicate porcelain oyster plates side by side with sturdy French copper pans on the walls, the vintage industrial Wolf stove with a salamander at the top, which I long suspected was leaking gas and might possibly kill all of us the next time someone lit a cigarette or joint, but fuck it, what a way to go. I scavenged and bargained and bought and bartered and haunted the thrift shops for things that would make my little apartment feel like a miniature version of the People's Palace, but also my own. I stripped linoleum off the floors and sanded and sealed the wide softwood boards. I replaced ordinary doorknobs with antique ones, plastic light switch plates with painted ceramic ones, lackluster lighting fixtures with a beaded Moroccan chandelier here and a Danish paper number there. And I came to believe that how one felt about my apartment was a reliable measure of how one felt about me. Love me, love my home. Sometimes I brought home the sort of person who resented its repleteness and mistook it for clutter, who disliked its colorfulness and confused it with chaos. That such people were judging me in the form of my apartment was self-satisfyingly obvious to them. That I was judging them back as dull and unimaginative and fearful, well, I doubt they had any notion. Thanks.
Also, I know we're all in separate rooms, but I still can't stop from clapping. That's what I do. Lisa, do you want to take us away next?
Sure. Rosie, I love that essay, by the way. Yeah, I was thinking, I just thought about how, like, some of my favorite places in New York are actually places that don't exist anymore. So like the ghost places of New York are like the ones that I'm so like clinging to, even though they've been gone for so long. And so I'm going to read a little bit of my essay, which is about the brief time that I did leave New York and moved to California and attempted to live there for a few years and then came back. At the San Francisco office of Vital Records, I paid $10 for a copy of the death certificate of a woman I had never met. It was September 2005, a few weeks before I'd broken up with my boyfriend of more than a year. My roommates and I had been hosting a party. We were moving out of our house the next day. My boyfriend had given me the silent treatment again because he saw me talking to a male friend. Exhausted, I had told him it was over. We'd been planning to move in together in the fall. Although I had known for months that it was the wrong decision, I had been afraid of breaking up with him. I was afraid of him. He never physically harmed me, but he was quick to rage in a way that frightened me. So I shipped my belongings to my parents' house in New Jersey, gave notice at my job at a film production company, made arrangements for work in New York City, and bought a cross-country train ticket. After 5 years at San Francisco, I was ready to return to New York, where I hoped he would never find me. The morning after the party, my roommate drove me to a studio apartment on a hilly side street that I was subletting for the next month. It was the first time I had lived alone in San Francisco, and I stayed up late watching movies and dreamily looking out a little window, the downtown lights just visible behind the thick fog. I read books at breakfast, bought flowers for the kitchen table. All my life, I have loved being alone. An only child, I grew up reading and writing stories while my parents worked. As an adult, some of my happiest times have been days by myself in new cities, as I wandered the streets of Tokyo and Bangkok and Paris, deciding what to do on a whim. It was a craving for anonymity that had brought me from New York to California in the first place. I was 25 and had never lived anywhere but in or near New York City. I love the city, but I didn't always want to live there without ever having lived somewhere else, temporarily, because New York was home. At first, I was suspicious of California's beauty, still too enthralled to New York cool, its sharpness and scale. Compared to New York, San Francisco was sleepy and toy-like. Everything shut down early. Lacking a comprehensive subway system, my friends and I rode our bikes around town like a pack of overgrown children. I had barely spent any time in San Francisco before I moved there. I first knew of it through my childhood pen pal, Marie Cicelli, a woman more than 70 years my senior. My father had met Marie when he was a college student from the Philippines, waiting tables in a San Francisco cafeteria on a summer break. Marie accidentally left a $20 bill on the table, far too large to be a tip back then. When she returned a few hours later, my father gave the money back to her, and they became friends. For years, Marie was my most loyal pen pal, sending typewritten letters on thick pastel stationery. She sent me postcards of the Golden Gate Bridge, detailing the weather, her room in a residency hotel in Voluptuous Hills. Now, 2 years before moving back to New York for good, living in my sublet, I remembered where Marie had lived. On post, it was unlikely she would be more than 100. I went out and walked around the street, but couldn't remember her address. I'll stop there. Thanks.
I'd like to just make a note, because Lisa moved back to New York City, and Leslie has been there a long time, and Emily's been there a long time, and most of the contributors actually live in New York City now. And I think a misconception that a lot of people have about Goodbye to All That is that everybody in the book is people who are gone from New York City forever and ever, and that is not the case. Like Joan Didion, a lot of the people who have stories about leaving have stories about coming back too. So a lot of it, but it's really all about the push-pull. So just wanted to note that after, Lisa's piece is very much about coming back.
That's perfect. And as somebody that, like you mentioned, I contributed to the second one, I'm now just can never leave the city. So I feel like I should have done this one, because then maybe I could have left and come back just at least a little bit. Emily, do you want to hit us next?
Yeah, I will. And just want to add, since I'm following Lisa, whose essay I really love, that I also had the privilege of being Lisa's a creative writing professor at the City College of New York, where I teach creative writing. And one of the things I love about living in New York is teaching writing in New York, because a lot of people come here to do that, to become writers. And, a lot of people from here pursue that. And it's such a pleasure to have watched Lisa's career blooming over the past few years. So pleased. Okay. So I'm going to read the first 2 pages of my essay, which is called Shelter in Place. And it has an epigraph, which I feel I should read because it's by one of my neighbors, the poet Sheila Maldonado, who lives in Washington Heights, which is, I insisted on the dark city. I persisted in the dark city. Everything I want to say about New York City happened one afternoon in J. Hood Wright Park at the start of the lockdown. Not since the children were toddlers have we spent so much time in this park, 5 blocks to the south of our building in Washington Heights. We needed public spaces during quarantine. We needed trees, fresh air, and the opportunity to gather, even at a distance. Without that respite, we'd have gone mad in the cells of our 3-room apartment, my family and I, the bewildering spring of 2020, when the boys turned 7 and 9. The governor and the mayor were in some cockfight about what to name the lockdown and who was running the show. The mayor warned us to shelter in place. The governor thought New Yorkers would riot under such oppressive language. Instead, we were on pause. So long as we behaved, the parks would remain open. But to me, pandemic time felt fast forwarded, not paused, even as the days without childcare were long, because the city and our access to it transformed so quickly. No more trips to the public library or the American Museum of Natural History. No more subway rides. The routine was pulled out from under us. When you are 43 in New York City raising children, you have already lost the New York that mattered to you at age 23. The loss I am talking about is something else entirely. Somewhere at the beginning of the curve, my college roommate called from the West Coast to ask if we'd be leaving the city. Where on earth did she think we would go? To my mother's house in New Jersey, she suggested, or to my brother's house down south. I told her edgily we were staying put. We would tough it out, I said, as if New York personally gave a fuck whether my family personally abandoned it. The truth was, nobody had offered us shelter. Maybe they feared we'd infect them. Had we thought about renting a place in the country for a time, she asked, genuinely concerned. Somewhere less congested, at least until the curve flattened. With what money? I bristled. Here's the thing. Before this virus reared its head, we'd sunk all our savings into a down payment on a rundown house in the Bronx at the end of the one line. The plan was to get away from the George Washington Bridge and the nexus of highways whose traffic fumes had given my kids asthma, along with a third of the other kids in our zip code. In the midst of this global pandemic, we were somehow going to close on this house, fix it up, and move in. Our jobs were here, uptown, where we were raising our boys, though now overnight, we were working remotely from the apartment we'd outgrown, in which we were now homeschooling. We were committed to New York, like married people with children are committed to each other. We were stuck, without free time or space to admit to regret. I just think it will be hard psychologically to be in the city during this crisis, my college roommate predicted. So many people are about to die. I resented her in that moment because I knew she was right and because we didn't have the option to leave. One night in mid-March, the super alerted us to shut the windows. He'd heard some story that turned out to be bullshit about helicopters spraying the city with disinfectant. By April, half our building had emptied out. Roughly speaking, the white half. As in the rest of the city, income was the strongest predictor of flight. Some of these neighbors handed us their keys before they fled for second homes or vacation towns, asking us to please shove their packages and mail inside their apartment doors. We said we'd see them on the other side, acknowledging the sudden divide between us. The other side was not the cure, since nobody could say with certainty when the vaccine would arrive and this purgatory would end. The other side was anywhere but here. And when we said we'd see them there, we didn't really mean it, because we didn't really believe they were coming back. I'll stop there.
Woo! Emily, that was fantastic. And
Thanks.
yeah, as somebody that was here the whole time as well, I think you really captured some difficult but also somewhat hopeful things of the last year. And again, it's amazing to have these kinds of new essays in this new edition that kind of speak to this new thing that New York just went through. Leslie, you wanna close us out here?
Sure, yeah. And then I'm excited to hear some questions from the audience. And I just say it's so wonderful to hear you guys read, Rosie and Lisa and Emily. And I wrote this in the chat, but Emily, I love that essay when I first read it, or read a version of it last year, and taught it to my students when we were trying to figure out these remote ways of being together and still feeling in community. And I remember loving, as I did hearing it just now, like the how much it captures both just the terror and difficulty and stuckness and divides that were so present in the city, but also that real feeling of like discovering it and seeing it in these new ways. So anyway, it's just a pleasure to hear you read it tonight. I'm gonna read my pieces about the first time I moved to the city. I was 22 years old, and I'm just gonna read a little tiny bit from the beginning. I'm actually gonna read an excerpt of it from the anthology. It's coming out in Harper's, and I'll just read the first few long paragraphs of that. It's called The Assistant's Loft. She had a name, but in this essay, she will just be she. When I started working for her, she gave me a non-disclosure agreement to sign, but she didn't handle any of her own paperwork, so she never knew I didn't sign it. She had a brownstone on the Upper West Side and a geriatric dog who peed frequently on the beautiful parquet floor. This was better than when he peed on the expensive Oriental rugs. She was a writer who'd built a menopause empire, which is to say, she had written many books about the sexual and emotional lives of postmenopausal women, and she'd made a lot of money doing it. Not enough. Shortly after I began working for her, I realized that part of the reason she kept multiple phone lines was to keep throwing creditors off her scent. I hadn't known that someone so wealthy could owe so much money. I hadn't known that anyone could earn tens of thousands of dollars for writing a single magazine article, or that this same person could also care so much about getting refunded for an unused jitney ticket to the Hamptons that she would pay someone $25 an hour to keep calling the bus company until she got it. That someone was me. I'd been told the job would involve, quote, substantial archival research at the New York Public Library. That happened twice. But it seemed impossibly exciting to work for an actual writer, a woman who was famous, to my mother and her friends at least, all of whom had read this woman's seminal account of postmenopausal puberty. Most days I worked as her personal assistant in a loft above her palatial living room, which was full of upholstered couches and heavy brocade curtains. The room seemed to be asking you to call it a parlor. The loft hadn't been built for this purpose, but it had been occupied by an assistant for so long, decades, that she had begun to think of the assistant, whatever her name was, as yet another piece of parlor furniture. Later, I would learn that there was a small group of former personal assistants who still met sometimes for cocktails, like an informal support group, to discuss the harrowing emotional experience of working for this woman. She was powerful but felt powerless. She cared quite a bit about her floral arrangements. She needed her coffee to be very, very hot. She yelled frequently at the people she employed. Sometimes it seemed as though she employed people so she could yell at them. I often locked myself in her beautiful black and white tiled bathroom so I could cry without being heard. At the time, I believe this said a lot about my boss. Looking back, I can also see it says a lot about me. My boss had an ill husband who was in a nursing home even farther uptown. He'd founded one of the most famous magazines in the country. In my mind, they were so powerful by virtue of their careers and their money that it was hard to imagine the ways they might be suffering. I was 23 years old, and it was hard to understand that the people who had the things I wanted most, bylines, long marriages, stature in the literary world, might be lacking other things I took for granted. I'm gonna stop there so we can talk a little more and hear some questions.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you so much to everybody. This was all so wonderful. We're pushing up against the end a little bit here, but there's one wonderful question. I mean, all the questions are wonderful. Thank you to everyone who submitted. But Sarah Scher wrote, what parts of New York City do you think you can, or do you try to recreate or bring with you when you go to another place? So what parts, or spiritually parts of New York City, do you try to bring with you or recreate when you do maybe move to that other place? And Rosie, again, I'm just going to start with you, because I mean, how long have you been in Ireland now?
I've been here a year and a half, but I'd been coming to Ireland since I was 20, which is 30 years ago. So I have a long relationship with this place. And I think one thing that made me feel comfortable in Ireland is something I think it shares with New York. People talk to each other. It is not a reticent place. People really talk. You're waiting in the queue at the shop in the village and everybody chats with you. Waiting for a bus in Dublin, everyone chats with you. And I think that kind of sort of openness of conversation is something I love so much about both places. But I think I maybe try to just carry a particularly New York kind of that openness with me, not only living here in Ireland, but when I'm around in the world, traveling. Back when we still traveled, I think that was a real gift New York gave me, that every day I met so many people, encountered so many faces and so many voices, and it made me not only open to that, but really love it. So I'm grateful to my many years in New York for that.
Rosie, I got to ask, I believe a terminology often used in Ireland and the UK for that kind of chat is it crack?
It's the crack, Isaac. We love the crack. Ireland is Ireland mainly because of the crack, I would say.
CRAIC. I just wanted to hear you say it. Thank you, Rosie. I appreciate that.
And I just want to say how wonderful it was to hear these essays that I'd already read and admired so much. To hear their authors read portions of them aloud made me love them even more.
Absolutely. What about you, Leslie? Is there?
Well, when I was thinking, I love that question and love hearing Rosie meditate a little bit about it. Love the word crack for my own Love Island low-key addiction. But yeah, I mean, the two things that were really coming to mind were sort of one, I guess, is an exporting from New York, but the other is, sometimes when I'm in the middle of an aggravating New York experience, I remember one time, being in a cab to an airport and being stuck in traffic in Chinatown and trying to think but it happens in stuck subways or, where I think, what if I was somebody who was visiting New York and was just taking all this in and I actually remember with Chinatown thinking I'm in the literally just looking out my window. There's so much to see right now, and somehow channeling that what if this experience that I feel totally trapped inside of was instead the very purpose of my coming to this moment and putting on those kind of lenses. It's not that it makes me be like, oh, I'm gonna miss my flight. Like, it doesn't make that feeling totally go away, but it is there's a way that maybe it's because I'm never going to be a person who's from New York, that I try to kind of turn that on, that switch sometimes, or just taking the queue over the bridge, or, you know, moments like that. But the other one that I was going to say was just, and it's not necessarily New York specific, but I think I really, really feel it here, is like that sense of being in what Emily called earlier, the kind of great experiment of shared space. Being in a bodega, being on a sidewalk, seeing all these strangers, knowing that they have these infinite lives that you actually can't totally conceptualize or imagine, but just carrying that sense of proximity, and like each person is infinite and I don't quite know their infinitude. I feel it so strongly here, and it's definitely something I take with me when I go other places, that kind of feeling of being around others. And of course, if you're a writer, you're always wondering or speculating, but also for me, trying to hold on to how much I don't know too. But just that feeling of the kind of richness of strangers, I think, is a real gift of life here, that gets taken everywhere else too.
I think that's beautiful. So well put. Emily, for you?
I'm reminded of what Sari was saying in her intro about, you know, this city has so many rewards and riches, but it's also a very difficult place to live. And so when I leave, either for travel or leisure, it's not, I don't want to take anything from New York with me. It's that I need to get out to have an antidote for the ways that it's hard. So I don't have anything I take with me. It's rather that I need to cleanse myself of the things that are difficult about it. So for example, I think we have a lot of sensory overload here. And when I leave, I try to go somewhere, be in a state where the pace is just slower. It's very hard to turn off here. I think the pandemic has taught us a little bit more in New York about how to be slower. It's like forced us to slow down. But because there's so much opportunity culturally, so many people, because there's really no privacy, because it's so noisy, when I leave, I really want to cleanse myself of the ways that New York is a constant assault and intrusion, like through the skin, into the brain. Yeah, there's nothing I want to take with me when I leave. And then after a while, I get so bored, I have to come back.
You like a solid break, a solid break. Emily, can I just ask one quick follow-up? When for you, and obviously we don't, you know, sometimes we feel overloaded and then we can't leave the city for one reason or another. But when for you, when is that? I think even Didion had it in the essay as like time to leave the fair.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not leave permanently, but when for you, what signals it's time for a break for Emily?
Yeah, I think just you know, when you're so wound up, like you need to run, or you need, like those of you who live in Brooklyn, you all mentioned Greenwood Cemetery. I'm not a Brooklynite, so I don't know that space, but it seems to me that it's offering something of what I'm talking about that you need when you leave, which is like a meditative or quiet space that is somehow like magical in a different way than the assault of and barrage of like all the sensory things that we also love but can feel overtaken and consumed by in a way that can feel like draining. You know, it's like a recharge. You need a recharge, and you can get that in the city even when you can't leave. It's usually by going to a park. We have so much green space, right? There's Central Park, but every neighborhood has its own little pocket, and we have water all around us. And sometimes, thanks to Robert Moses, it's difficult to like access the water, but it's there. So for me, you know, up in Washington Heights, I'm looking at it right now. There's a George Washington Bridge out my window, and if I snake down and go down like a complicated ramp and stairway and cliff, I can get to the Hudson River, and there's a little red lighthouse and a sense of like peace and quietude in spite of the cyclists who are insanely zipping behind me on the path, right? There's the water, and it's still, and that's always there for you.
I love that. Lisa?
Yeah, Emily, what you said made me think about, like, you know, I feel like what I often take with me is this idea that everything has to be really hard because I'm like so used to it. And so I definitely take with me this idea that I should just walk everywhere. I mean, partly I'm 45 years old. I just got my driver's license last year. I'm also really good at public transportation, having been forced to take it for so long. But I'll like literally go to like cities like LA or Dallas and be like, oh, it's like 2 miles away. I'll just walk. And I'm like, walking with groceries on a highway, and like people are like, why do you do that? And life and street life in New York, and that way of like getting to know a city and getting to be like among other people, but also sometimes in other places it's just not like tenable or like not possible to even walk in some of these places.
I want to mention also, I walk all over Kingston, and this is a driving town. But I recently moved to the area called Midtown, largely so that I could walk to a lot of places. We bought a house in a city, in a downtown area, so that I could walk the way I walked all over New York City. And the other thing that I have tried to bring here is literary community, which wasn't here for me. I mean, there is a literary community here in upstate, but like a really close-knit one, like we had like I was part of in Manhattan and Brooklyn. So I started a writer's co-working space a few years ago up here, but I had to close it because of the pandemic. And that was really hard for me because it was it kind of made Kingston more doable for me. I miss New York City so much, and having a space where a bunch of writers, most of them who had lived in New York City, could come and meet each day, that kind of gave me a little bit more of a feeling of being part of, New York City literary community. And I still am part of that here. I call it the, Kingston Literary Mafia. There's a bunch of us who moved up from New York, and we get together all the time, and it's really wonderful. But it helps me feel as if a piece of my heart still beats down there, because it totally does.
It absolutely does. All right, we do have time. I got a little heads up that we have time for just like one last question. And sorry, I'm gonna, because it speaks to what you were just speaking about, I'm gonna start with you on this one, which is, when you live somewhere else, or even when you spend some time in another place. This is from Barbara Woods. Does it allow you to see New York City more clearly?
Absolutely.
And if so, how?
Yeah, I can really see my life there, and the city itself in a way that I couldn't always see it when I was immersed in it. And there were times when I was there, as I said, it's a hard place to stay, it's a hard place to leave. There were times when I felt trapped there, and as if I was going to be stuck in my 350 square foot shoebox of an apartment. But to be away from it, I feel like I've been able to write about it better from a distance, and appreciate it more from a distance. So that's my answer.
I love it. Lisa?
Yeah, same. I feel like I miss it more when I'm away. Maybe I take things for granted while I'm here. But then when I don't have it, I feel their lack in a very pronounced way. I was in Las Vegas for like 3 months last year, at the beginning of last year, for a residency, and yeah, it's such a different place than New York. And I felt like just, even though I was living in an apartment with a washer dryer, which was like amazing, like I was just, it was like the first time in my life I could like launder all the time, and like all these things that I took for granted. But I definitely felt like coming back was like coming home, and I could like fully be myself in a way that I couldn't.
Absolutely. Leslie?
Yeah, I mean, I think with I honestly I think I've only ever written really about New York from a position of being in New York, so I don't know how much I have to compare it to, but I do think it's so true. Really everything Sari and Lisa are saying about distance or being away from something, sort of sharpening your gaze a bit, is certainly true for me, and it's sort of it has something to do with the effect of like when you're swimming through water, it's hard to be aware of it as such, or when it's so much the air around you, it's it doesn't come into focus as easily. But then I think I'm also always on the lookout for like the ways that nostalgia or distance sort of rearrange the rooms of memory or tidy up what things look like, or, you know, I mean, memory distorts in 1,000 ways, but I think sometimes even that distortion is really interesting. Like, how has being away from a place allowed you or invited you to turn it into a representation of some part of yourself or your experience that you feel far away from? So even those kind of funhouse mirror distortions actually don't feel necessarily always like obstacles to the truth. They're their own, the distortion is its own kind of truth too.
I think that's beautifully well said. Emily?
Yeah, with respect to the fact that we're at the end of the hour, I'll say, like Leslie, I write about New York from the position of being within it. And I think when you're doing that, it's like, I think the task also is to try to capture the New York that you're in. As you said, Isaac, there's so many ghosts and layers to this city. There's so much history. And it transforms so quickly. Like Lisa said, you know, you can't walk by a block that you've walked by before without observing some change, you know, like, and having a memory of the ghost of your former self in that space. Like, oh, I had a kiss with somebody in that bar that's no longer there and is now a fish store or something like this. So I think sometimes that the act of writing about New York from being within it is also about preserving the New York or the self in New York that you exist in at the moment, in an effort to, you know, to make a time capsule of what it was. So for me, a lot of it is just trying to record, even with a camera, what am I seeing? What moment is this? And then too, like, how many New Yorks have we all experienced? Like, I'm in the parents' New York right now, like we were saying, Leslie and I, from the also reliving it, being re-enchanted by it through the eyes of a child. We spend so much time in playgrounds. Like, when are you ever in playgrounds as an adult without kids? You're like a problem if you're that, you know. Or if you're like a, you know, there's a dog's eye view of New York when does anybody have a dog like in New York? I mean, that's a whole different kind of identity, right? Your relationship to other New Yorkers with whom you would not interact if were it not for the fact that you both own dogs, which bring you to this dog run and this dog park. There's the bikers New York. You know, Lisa was saying she's been a cyclist. Like, that's a whole different view of the city because you know your position is just changed. And so I think, you know, when you live here long enough, you it's so many things. It's hard to describe. It's like that parable of the elephant and all the blind men trying to say, what is this? But I think being hyper local about one's experience and of the city on a granular level and what it is and what it means to oneself at the time one's writing is an important way of cataloging like a moment in the history of this city, which is under constant transformation and flux.
Absolutely. And we end as we began with Rosie, the farthest New Yorker born and raised and so far from home.
This has made me feel a little bit like I'm back at home. It's been really wonderful. You know, I've been thinking, even though I write nonfiction and not so much poetry at this point, I've been thinking about Wordsworth's line about, you know, poetry being a emotion recollected in tranquility. And I feel I have more tranquility when I think and write about New York now. It feels more relaxed to me to reflect on it and to get it on the page than it was when I was actually there.
So you're finding that success?
Is it success? I don't know if I can judge that, but I do feel a kind of more easeful temperament about it.
Beautiful.
Which is nice.
Which we will take.